So here's an ancient story about two kings, a good king and a bad king. The good king, he decided to pay a royal visit to the bad king. And while they were sitting there on their thrones discussing kingly things, the bad king said, "Listen, I've got this enemy and I was wondering if you'd want to join forces and help me defeat him." And the good king said, "Well, we should first consult God's will, find out what God's will is. So are there any prophets of God in your kingdom?" The bad king sent word out throughout his kingdom, and an impressive 400 prophets showed up, all simultaneously saying the exact same things of how wonderful the bad king was and how, of course, it was God's will that they should go and fight and God would give them victory. In fact, the main prophet, he made 2 horns out of iron and said that with those horns, God would help him gore his enemies. Now, the good king, obviously somewhat suspicious, said, "Well, are there any other prophets we can consult?" And the bad king said, "Well, yes, there is one other prophet, but I hate him because he never has a good thing to say about me." Word was sent for this one lone prophet. And as this prophet was about to enter the king's presence, one of the bad king's aides said to him, "Listen, buddy, all the other prophets, there's 400 here, they're all saying how wonderful the king is and how God is going to give the king victory. So just play along, will you? Just be a good boy." But the prophet said, "I can only speak what God tells me to speak." Long story short, the prophet said that if those 2 kings went to war, they would lose. Moreover, the bad king would be killed. And with that, the bad king turned to the good king and said, "See, didn't I tell you that this guy never has anything good to say about me?" And he threw that prophet in prison. So the kings went to war anyway. And just to make sure that, just in case there was some truth into what that prophet warned about, the bad king, he decided not to wear his royal robes into battle, which was common in those days for kings to do when they led their troops in a war. He instead decided to disguise himself in regular charioteer armor. Yet the story ends with a random archer on the opposing side firing a random arrow that just so happened to hit the bad king in between his plates of armor, proving fatal. Now that ancient story is actually found in the Old Testament of the Bible, 1 Kings 22. Yet even though it's a 3,000-year-old story, here's 3 important moral lessons we can draw from it. The first is confirmation bias. We see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear. And we're all addicts to one degree or another of confirmation bias. King Ahab, the bad king, he was a junkie to confirmation bias. He had gathered around himself just a bunch of yes men who were more than willing to simply lie straight in the face of the king, no matter the consequences to the kingdom. Now, even though he was that bad at confirmation bias, you would have at least thought that he would have been like King Jehoshaphat, at least somewhat suspicious, somewhat skeptical that those 400 prophets all parroted the exact same thing. In sharp contrast, it reminds me of another Old Testament story found in the book of Daniel, dealing with King Nebuchadnezzar. The story goes that one night he had a terrifying dream that he could make no sense of it. And sensing that it was a message from the gods trying to tell him something, he gathered around, he sent message out throughout his kingdom to gather together all those who claimed to be able to have the power to interpret dreams. And yet he wisely, when they had all come before him, he didn't actually tell them the dream, what he saw, because he reasoned that, well, if these people allegedly had the power to interpret dreams, then surely they had the power to know what the dream was about without being told. And of course that was to filter out those fraudsters who upon hearing the dream, could come up with any wild interpretation. He wanted to find the genuine people who had the power to tell him what it was. Long story short, there was only one person who could do both, and that was the prophet Daniel. Now, going back to the original ancient story, the one with King Ahab, the bad king, it's easy for us to laugh at his sheer folly. Surely we would never do something like that, right? Well, let's just say that I'm so old that I grew up before the age of the internet. I remember when the internet, I guess in the early 90s, when it first started to become a thing, there was this optimism, this hope that we were entering a new age of enlightenment, of open-mindedness, of tolerance. The hope was that now everyone had access to the world's information, and that in time, we would all be exposed to new ideas, that bad ideas would simply fall away and the good ones would filter up to the top. And that, we enter this new age of enlightenment. And yet time has proven that that's not really the case, right? With our own inherent confirmation biases, combined with the algorithms, when we do our own research, we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear. And I would say that as a society, we're now probably more divided, more tribal than before the age of the internet. The second moral lesson we can draw from this ancient story is not only do we hear what we want to hear and see what we want to see, but there are countless individuals out there, people, groups, who are more than willing to confirm our confirmation biases, no matter the consequences to us or even to them. And as a young person watching this video, if you are a young person, you really, really need to understand this. Just think of those 400 prophets, all claiming to be speaking for God, how their calling was a sacred one, a sacred duty, and yet they were more than willing to abuse that duty to benefit themselves. Another thing is, they didn't care who got hurt. They didn't care that they were egging their king on to wage war. I mean, think about that. Encouraging their king to go to war in which thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people would die. And they had no idea if their side was going to win or not. But they didn't care. All they cared was about what benefited them in the moment. And again, if you're a young person watching this video right now, you need to understand that the world is full of such people, even today. That, okay, they may not be calling for war, but there are many people out there who are pushing self-destructive and harmful agendas upon our culture, upon our society. And they don't care who gets hurt as long as they benefit from it. They get more clicks on social media. They make more money. They sell more books. These kinds of people don't care. They're more than willing to tell us what we want to hear and show us what we want to see. So in other words, I guess, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. The third moral lesson of this ancient story is that speaking the truth to those who don't want to hear it is costly. That one lone prophet who spoke the truth to the king, well, he was thrown into prison as a result. Just think of how much easier his life would have been if he had simply gone along and parroted what all the other so-called prophets were saying. Now, we'd all like to think that if we had been in those prophets' shoes or his sandals, we would have done the exact same thing. We would have spoken truth to power no matter the consequences. No, we wouldn't have. We probably would have caved and been just like all those other false prophets. Just think of our own lives, our own circumstances and situations where we tell people what they want to hear, we show them what they want to see, even if it's harmful to them and to those around them. No, we're really not much different from those 400 prophets, nor are we really much different than King Ahab himself. God have mercy on our souls.